I'm going to pass around the sign-in sheet for those of you who are not already on our mailing list. If you received a mailing from me about this event, you don't need to add it. But if you did not and would like to, please sign your name, and I have yours. So okay. Our talk today is the legacy of Stalin, and we have Gary Hicks of the Communist Party and other organizations to begin our talk. I'll have a few things to say, and then we will go on to discussion. We want to apologize that both Gary and I have other commitments, and we need to leave by noon. So we're going to end the formal presentation at noon. However, Bob tells me that he's willing to stay here till midnight.
Midnight, that's right. Anything you want to talk about.
Okay. So Gary, you want to start off?
Yeah. The reason we're leaving at noon, by the way, is because some of us are going up to the Veterans Hospital at Martinez. There's going to be a living ceremony for a dear comrade of ours, Jean Damour, who's dying of cancer. So we have to. Anyway, I want to start with a quote from Joseph Stalin in 1931. It is sometimes asked whether it is not possible to slow down the tempo a bit, to put a check on the movement. No, comrades, it is not possible. The tempo must not be reduced. On the contrary, we must increase it as much as it is within our powers and possibilities. To slacken the tempo would mean falling behind. To those who fall behind get beaten. No, we refuse to be beaten. One feature of the history of old Russia was the continued beatings she suffered for falling behind. She was beaten by the Mongol Khans. She was beaten by the Turkish Beys. She was beaten by the Swedish feudal lords. She was beaten by the Polish and Lithuanian gentry. She was beaten by British and French capitalists. She was beaten by the Japanese barons. All beat her for her backwardness, her military backwardness, for cultural backwardness, for political backwardness, for industrial backwardness, for agricultural backwardness. This is why we must no longer lag behind. Do you want our socialist fatherland to be beaten and lose its independence? If you do not want this, you must put an end to its backwardness in the shortest possible time. There is no other way. This is why Lenin said during the October Revolution, either perish or overtake and outstrip the advanced capitalist countries. We are 50 or 100 years behind the advanced countries. We must make good this distance in 10 years. Either we do it or they crush us. This is Joseph Stalin in 1931, 2 years after the beginning of the collectivization process in the Soviet Union. 2 years later, almost to the month, Adolf Hitler assumed power in Germany, unleashing a multifaceted terror, military, social, economic, that we've come to know as fascism. It was only this speed up of industrialization and the accumulation of advanced industrial means of production and collectivized beginnings of agro-industry that allowed the USSR to withstand the German invasion of 1941 and its resultant Great Patriotic War in response of the Soviets, which turned out to be the deciding factor of which alliance won the Second World War. Now, there is no end of opinions, anecdotes, stories, and here and there actual accurate accounts of the role of Joseph Stalin in this historic drama. For purposes of managing reality, remember this is going to be a short event today. I'm going to leave out the question of the purges, the trials, the executions of 1934 through 38, 39. These episodes happened. Much has been and will continue to be made of all this. Today I want to simply focus on the diplomatic history and second on the concepts of united/popular fronts and what problems the precepts of this political construct put forth. But the United Front, Popular Front strategy was part of the foundation of victory over Nazism, militarism, fascism in those years is not a question here. The question is the trade-offs in politics that were exacted in order to be able to build those constructs. Now, starting with the Nazi aggression in 1934, accompanied by Italian forays into Ethiopia, Japan into Manchuria, and German-Italian support of Spanish fascism in subsequent years, it was apparent from the Soviet view to their west that the most vociferous expressions of capitalism were out to get them. This became clearer with the constant demurring, denying, other maneuverings of France and Britain and the United States in their refusal to hold Germany accountable to the military aspect of the Versailles Treaty that came out of World War I. By 1938, 1939, with the capitulation of Britain and France to Germany at Munich, allowing Germany to annex Czechoslovakia, and the fall of Madrid to Franco in March of 1939. It became clear that the Soviets had to ward off an inevitable conflict by any means necessary. War was going to happen sooner or later. The Soviets wanted to fight later. And so beginning March and ending in August, almost 2 weeks before the German invasion of Poland, the Soviets engaged in one set of talks with England and France to try to get them to enforce Versailles, and another set of talks with Germany to effect a non-aggression pact. The latter arrangement was clinched, and Britain and France, owing to intricate treaties with Poland and others, found themselves on the attack side of the opening gambits of World War II. The Soviets acquired parts of Poland, seized from them nearly 2 decades earlier in civil wars and invasions by various capitalist powers during the early 1920s. They also reacquired in 1940 Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, countries that had been released in 1917 from Tsarist suzerainty, and 20-odd years later, now we're under fascist governments friendly to Hitler. And the Soviets needed geographical buffer space between them and the Germans. At last, after nearly 2 years of German military subjugation of Western, Southern, Northern Europe, and major parts of North Africa, on June 22nd, 1941, the Germans unleashed Operation Barbarossa, aimed at destroying Soviet power, acquiring oil in Iran, Azerbaijan, and ultimately linking up with Japan in northern India, Himalaya regions. Ahmadinejad, who has written a book called Heroic Struggle, Bitter Defeat, Factors Contributing to the Dismantling of the Socialist State in the USSR, has a piece to say about, about what this was like. More than 20 million people of the Soviet Union, a large part of the country's labor force and its revolutionary citizens, perished in the war against fascism. The occupying German forces pillaged 1,710 cities and towns in the most industrialized area of the country and burned down more than 70,000 rural towns, 32,000 industrial units, 65,000 kilometers of railroad tracks were ruined. 98,000 cooperatives and nearly 5,000 state agricultural enterprises, tractor and farm machinery stations were looted. Tens of thousands of hospitals, schools, art schools, higher education institutes, and libraries were completely destroyed. In total, the damage from the fascist invasion of the Soviet Union was more than 2.6 trillion rubles, 680 billion rubles of which were material values. The late John F. Kennedy put this another way. He said that if it had happened in the United States, it would have been as though not one brick would have been standing on top of another from the Atlantic coast to the Mississippi River.
JFK.
Yeah, that was JFK. But because of the rapid industrialization process of the late 20s and 30s, not only were the Soviets able to relocate much of their production abilities eastward beyond the Ural Mountains, I mean, they were able, not only were they able to do this, but they were able to produce humongous amounts of tanks and planes and missiles and newly developed weapons and stuff. And I'm going to let no less a source than Isaac Deutscher explain this. Throughout the war, Russia was confronted with German armies roughly twice as numerous and strong as those that had defeated her in the First World War. The Russian achievement was made possible primarily by the rapid industrialization of the eastern provinces, much of which took place in the course of the war on a basis prepared for peace. The industrial output of the provinces that escaped German occupation was normally about 40% of the total Soviet output. It was doubled between 1942 and 1945. The production of the armament factories in the East went up by 500 to 600%. On the average, 30,000 tanks and fighting vehicles and nearly 40,000 planes were turned out every year between 1943 and 1945. Almost none of these had been manufactured in Russia during the First World War. The annual output of artillery guns was now 120,000 compared with less than 4,000 in 1914, 1917. The Russian army was supplied with nearly 450,000 home-produced machine guns annually. Only about 9,000 had been produced under design. 5 million rifles and Tommy guns, 5 times as many as in the First World War, were produced every year. The Red Army fought its way from the Volga to the Elbe, mainly with home-produced weapons. The weapons which the Western powers supplied were a useful and in some cases a vital addition. But the lorries which carried the Russian divisions into Germany were mostly American, Canadian, and British make. More than 400,000 lorries were supplied to Russia under Lend-Lease. So were most of the boots in which the infinitely proper slogged its way to Berlin through the mud and snow and sand of the Eastern European plain. Much of the Army's clothing and of its tinned food was supplied under Lend-Lease. One might sum up broadly that the firepower of the Red Army was home-produced, whereas the element of its mobility was largely imported. And I would actually want to add to that the stuff that was brought into the Soviets from the Canadians and the Americans came by merchant marine going up through Norway, going up to Murmansk. And something like 1 out of every 3 ships on the Murmansk run was sunk by U-boats operating out of Norway. The so-called wolf packs. So, a lot, as significant as that aid was, it wasn't nearly as much as could have been had. I focused on the military diplomatic side of these events, but wars, as popularly described, is the pursuit of politics by other means. A political expression. On the so-called Allied side of World War II, Great Patriotic War, the expression was the anti-Hitler coalition. This was the cross-class popular front expressed as state power, the power of Churchill, Stalin, and Roosevelt at their heads. The big 3.
What is it? What are you saying?
The big 3.
Thank you.
Several different classes, international classes, social classes, but fighting as national entities, and mobilized along patriotic and cultural lines rather than those of class. The communist parties became more prone to patriotism, illusions about reasonable sections of the capitalist class. Trade union leadership becomes more concerned with national production. Fernando Claudin, who was in the Spanish party at one point, I think this describes these suppositions pretty accurately. As long as the war lasted, the principal justification which absorbed all the others put forward from time to time could be reduced to the following schema. A. The victory of Hitler's Germany would mean the destruction of the Soviet Union and the crushing for an indefinite period of the working class movements in Europe. B. Therefore, the principal aim must be victory over Germany. C. To ensure the defeat of Germany, the essential condition was to ensure the solidarity of the anti-Hitler coalition. D. Raising the problem of a socialist perspective, making the aim of the seizure of power by the proletariat would inevitably lead to a confrontation with the Western Allies, which would threaten the chances of victory. And E, therefore it was impossible at the present stage to consider the socialist alternative. So that in the United States, as a result, I mean, as an example of what can happen when you take those, when you particularize those assumptions that Claudine just put forth. You get what we call in the United States Browderism, after Earl Browder. That is a split in the assumption that there's a split in the capitalist order along progressive, reasonable, and reactionary fascist lines, and that somehow the forces of progress, the communist parties, the trade unions, and folks can deal with the more reasonable sectors of the capitalist class. To uphold the assumption, among other things, the need to revive, quote, progressive, unquote, cultural, historical themes along national lines. So that, for example, we'll uphold Frederick Douglass and John Brown, but also George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, etc., etc. So that you'll get rather weird things happening. Like, for example, you'll have a Marxist school in New York which teaches 10,000 people during its heyday in the 1940s, called the Jefferson School, named after a slave master. What's wrong with this picture? And then you'll also get things like the liquidation of working class politics, especially the Communist Party, certain trade union formations, and so forth. But Browderism is also an international phenomenon. It's not something particular to the United States. In the early 1940s, I think we have a copy of it somewhere upstairs here in our archives. A special issue of Political Affairs of all kinds of different personalities from communist parties all over the world lauding Earl Browder because, at a point when he was in jail because Roosevelt had put him in jail because he violated the Smith Act or something like that. So there's so this guy is internationally known. Jacques Duclos writes a letter condemning Browderism, but even he is not in a position to be able to stop that phenomena from happening in his own party, the French Party, which has has some very serious problems, not only on class collaboration at home, but also not understanding the need to come to some kind of decent conclusion on French colonial policy in Indochina and Algeria, for example. And finally, when the South African Communist Party liquidates in 1949, under pressure from the South African apartheid government, the new apartheid government at that time, they re-established themselves about 3 or 4 years later, and they characterized that 4-year period as a Browder moment in the history of their party. So, I guess all this, I'm trying to say that all this, what we had here was, we had this united front. And it was based on a whole bunch of assumptions. And that united front worked in terms of beating the Nazis and the Japanese and the Italians. I mean, as a method of mobilization, it worked in beating those guys. But we are living with some very serious trade-offs today in terms of what happened to the communist parties and various other progressive forces following that conflict. I'm done.
Gene?